I want to speak directly to the business that we're all in, which is teaching economics. And I teach a very, very, very large class at Michigan. And I wanted to tell you a little about how I've been thinking about teaching business cycles. And so let me just begin with 4 questions. And I'll tell you, actually, the real genesis is I spent a lot of time talking to instructors around the country. And I know that each of us has that one class each semester that you kind of dread teaching. You wake up and you're like, oh, it's that day today. And if it's something that you don't feel that you can teach authentically, it's even worse than that. It's like, oh, it's that day, and I better look up the notes to remember the economics of this because I'm not quite sure I believe what I'm about to teach, and I have to memorize it just so. And it's that feeling of inauthenticity that I think then means you go into the room and it feels awful to you and it probably doesn't connect with your students. So I often ask people, what is that day for you? And I didn't run an iClicker question, but I will tell you the result. Overwhelmingly it's macro, not micro. Take a bow, macroeconomics. And within that, overwhelmingly, it's aggregate demand, aggregate supply. And so there's some love there for it. Let me start by asking you 4 questions about this framework. The first is, when you naturally try to make sense of the world, the latest data that came out, for instance, are you doing it through an AD-AS frame? Secondly, when you listen to the language that policymakers use, if you listen to Jay, if you listen to Janet, is this the language that they use? Third, when you read about it in the newspaper, is this the language that the media reports on, which of course is the world in which our students will be embedded? And fourth, do your students find this language to be intuitive? My conjecture is the answers to all 4 are no, 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 and no. So look, here I see 2 possible solutions. Here's where we all are right now, where we go into work and we're trying to teach our AD-AS and our undergraduate students. And we want to get to a happier place. So I see 2 roads to that happier place. One, fix how we teach it, and the other is replace what we're teaching. So I'm going to give the talk in 2 paths. We'll walk down the green path together, and then we'll come back and we'll walk down the purple path, and at the end of that you can decide which path works best for you. And my hope is that for few of us, it's going to be just remaining where we are. So can we improve and modernize AD-AS so it's intuitive, so it speaks to our students, and so it coheres with the world in which they exist? Or alternatively, can we teach what I'm going to call the Fed's model, which is just a mildly adapted version of ISLM or ISMP? So let me start by saying, can we improve and modernize the traditional AD-AS approach? Here's a really fun trick. Walk down the hallway to one of your macroeconomist colleagues who is not currently teaching principles of intermediate, and say to them, oh, I'm about to teach my class, can you remind me, why does the AD curve slope down? If you try this on the Michigan campus, your colleagues look at you and they say, I forget, but I know how to look it up for when I teach next. This, of course, is because this is not how economists actually think about the world. And I do know when I have to teach this, I actually do go and look up the book and I take a deep breath and I'm like, I try and remember what these stories are. And the thing is, we inherited a whole lot of stories, and we inherited them from the 1960s, but it's not clear that they're right now, and some of them it's not clear that they were ever right. So the first is the interest rate effect, which I think is sometimes called the Keynes effect. This is the claim that the Fed just puts out a fixed money supply. And so therefore, if the price level were to rise and the Fed maintains a fixed nominal money supply, that must mean that the real money supply falls. The Fed observes that the real money supply falls and decides to do nothing. As a result of allowing the real money supply to fall, the real interest rate rises. The Fed just sits back and says, that's fine, do what you want. And as a result of the real interest rate rising, people demand less stuff, right? They consume less, they produce less. They consume less, they invest less, and so on. There's only 2 serious problems with this. The first is that the Fed has not set the money supply since the 1970s. The second is, even in the 1970s, the Fed was not passive. And it didn't just say, well, if the price level moves around, well, what the heck, we don't care, the real money supply is allowed to change. So this was a story that in some sense was never true. We have a different story. This is story number 2 we inherited from the 60s, which is the wealth effect, sometimes called the Pigou effect. This is the story that says, well, if the price level were to rise, then the value of real balances, nominal balances divided by the price level, if the price level rises, then that must mean real wealth falls. And if that's the case, then consumption will fall. And if that's the case, then aggregate demand will decline. The real problem here is almost every asset, there's an offsetting, for everything on one side of the balance sheet, there's something on the other side. So the problem here is it will reduce the value of nominal debts just as much as it reduces the value of nominal balances. So the only asset this doesn't apply to is cash, because it's it comes from the government, right? Now open your wallet. Open your wallet. How much cash is in your wallet? So in mine, there's $20 US. For my students, there's not even that. They all have Venmo balances, and the Venmo balances go back to the logic of someone's asset is someone else's liability. So this is a pathway that works, but it works through a $20 bill. And then if the real value of my wealth were to change, if inflation were 10%, that $20 bill is now worth $18. That's the wealth effect. And we think the marginal propensity to consume out of wealth is about 0.05. And so now you can see that this wealth effect is literally pennies. So this one isn't false, it's just infinitesimally small. The third story we inherited was the international trade effect, which is the price level rises. And if the nominal exchange rate doesn't change, and we can say that in intro because we haven't talked about nominal exchange rates. So if it doesn't change, then the real exchange rate rises, therefore US goods become more competitive overseas, therefore net exports fall, and that's part of aggregate demand. The problem, of course, is the idea that the nominal exchange rate is sticky. It's the least sticky price in the whole economy, right? It's moving second by second by second by second. And in fact, if you believe our standard models, you think if the US price level rises 10%, you think the value of the dollar is going to adjust 10%. And so there'll be no effect whatsoever on the real exchange rate. And so this is a story that I think is utterly unclear, might not work at all, might work in the wrong direction, might be small. So these stories just don't work. And so these are the lies we've been telling our students. Question is, can we tell our students the truth and still have an aggregate demand curve that's downward sloping? And the answer is yes, we can. So a modern interpretation is to say, well, when the price level rises, now I'm going to use that most important of economic ideas, a definition, and say, if this year's price level is higher and last year's price level was set in stone, then we know this year's inflation rate is higher. We have an inflation targeting central bank, so if this year's inflation rate is higher, the central bank will raise the real interest rate. Because it raises the real interest rate, people spend less and aggregate demand declines. So this now is a coherent, truthful account of how a higher price level can lead to a lower quantity demanded. So the aggregate demand curve's not dead, just the story we tell about it has to be one that reflects the world we live in. This is at stark odds to the way most of us are educated. So all of this then, this very simple modern story, which puts the Fed at the heart of the matter, gives us a downward sloping demand curve, right? The lower the price level, therefore the lower the interest rate, the Fed will cut rates, that'll raise the quantity of output demanded. Simple as that. It works. So that's the good news. We can resuscitate AD-AS. So why is it we would want to resuscitate it? And when I talk to people, why do you like this? They tell me it's because there's a very clear intellectual analogy between supply and demand in microeconomics and supply and demand in macroeconomics. The claim is these are very similar looking tools. We always claim parenthetically, but of course these are about fundamentally different ideas. And we keep that claim in really small font so the students don't realize it, and we hope that they somehow use their micro skills in macro and that helps them get through. So it's time for a pop quiz. Here's the pop quiz. A decrease in demand will cause A, the demand curve to shift left, B, the supply curve to shift right, C, a movement along the supply curve, or D, a movement along the demand curve. I hope you've each checked your answer in. Write it in the margin of your notepad right now. You've got your answer. The answer is, of course, It depends whether this is a class in microeconomics or macroeconomics. In microeconomics, it's A. In macroeconomics, it's E, all of the above. The analogy that we're trying to draw turns out to be utterly false, and if we sell the analogy, we're going to turn our students into good macroeconomists and terrible microeconomists. Let me explain. In microeconomics, we say if there's a decrease in demand, that a demand curve shifts to the left, and that causes a movement along the supply curve, a decrease in price, decrease in quantity. And that's the whole story. That's what comparative statics are. Something moves a curve, the curve moves. Done. Isn't economics beautiful? Microeconomists in the room should take a bow now at the elegant simplicity of their models. Let's try macroeconomics. If there's a decline in aggregate demand, what happens? Well, the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. And then there's the miracle of an immaculate shifting. Somehow a shift in the aggregate demand curve now means that we have unemployment, that bids wages down, that therefore causes, the shift in the demand curve causes a shift in the supply curve. We don't allow that in microeconomics. And then you say, how many times are we allowed to keep doing that? We do that until we get this fifth curve. And as a teacher, I think there should be a rule against graphs with 5 curves. So the analogy, which is the greatest selling point, is a false analogy. And so this leads to, I think, this is why this is our least favorite day to teach. Because it leads to a very tortured explanation in class. And here's Greg Mankey's textbook. I'm going to pick on Greg because he's a friend of mine. And so Greg here has got the obvious, what happens when demand declines? Well, a lot of curves form curve spaghetti. And here we've got 5 curves and 4 drop lines and 3 letters and 3 more comments. And if you try teaching this, you'll end up looking like this guy. And that's why this is the worst day of the year, right? Now, it doesn't have to be that way. Let me find a way of teaching the exact same model and the exact same insights while still respecting the rule that we should only have 3 lines on the chart. In fact, only 2 in many cases. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to think about the world in terms of 2 extremes. First of all, let's think about what happens in the long run. In the long run, and the way that I teach this is I actually turn the projector off and I say, what I want you to do is imagine that you fell asleep for 10 years and you woke up 10 years later and every price in the economy had an extra 0 on the end of it, and every bill, every note in your wallet has an extra 0 on the end of it, and every account balance has an extra 0 on the end of it. And then I want to say, how different is the world now after you woke up than when you went to sleep? And the answer is, there's a lot more zeros, but none of us will change any choices that we make. And so that's monetary neutrality. We all know the argument. We can make that in very simple 101 terms. So that's a long-run vertical supply curve. It says at any price level, we'll have the same level of output. The other extreme is, what happens if we woke up tomorrow and there'd been a big change? If I woke up tomorrow and it's really hard to change prices, I can't change prices. That's the simplest argument I ever made. It's circular. If you can't change price, the price doesn't change. That therefore means the supply curve is horizontal. So they're the 2 extremes. Tomorrow it's horizontal. In 10 years it's vertical. There must be something in between. In between, there's the short run aggregate supply curve, where if a few companies have had time to adjust, say if there's a lot of demand for output, a few of them will raise their prices, but not all of them. And then there's not just the short run, there's the medium run. In the medium run, a few more will have a chance to change their price tags. And so then it becomes more vertical. Now we've got a whole family of aggregate supply curves, and this yields what I call the comic strip approach to AD-AS. Let's start with, we know what happens in the very short run. The AS curve is horizontal. We know what happens in the long run, it's vertical. In between, it becomes more steep. Now we've got our comic strip set up. All we need to do is say, what happens if there's a decline in aggregate demand? Which I've done, I've already shown that on each of these graphs, right? Now here's the magic. I can say, what happens over time? And this is actually how macroeconomists do the work. This is the dynamic part of dynamic economics. So here I'm going to say, here's the price level over time. So in the very short run, we know what happens. Nothing happens to the price level because no one's had time to change their prices. Then wait for this. This is my favorite ever PowerPoint animation. What happens in the short run to the price level? It's that arrow there, right? It falls a little bit. Well, let's move that arrow. What happens in the medium run? That arrow comes down here, and what happens in the long run? Ooh, there it goes. And now we have not what happens to the price level at any specific time horizon, but over all time horizons, what happens to the price level after a decline in aggregate demand. Notice there's only 3 curves on any of these graphs. And so the analogy between micro supply and demand and macro supply and demand I've retained. And the dynamics of this, I think, become a lot simpler because it's just drawing graphs that you are used to drawing from macro. Now, again, this is not just what happens to the price level. This now, I'm just going to top that last PowerPoint animation. What happens to output? Well, in the short run, all the action is that the output declines a lot. It declines by this much. So let's take this arrow and bring it down here. In the medium run, it declines by a moderate amount. Sorry, in the short run, a moderate amount. By the medium run, a small amount. And in the long run, we've got monetary neutrality. So now we know what happens to output over time. And we get an impulse response, which is also how macroeconomists do their work. And now you might say, well, that's a great framework. What's the proof of the pudding? The proof of the pudding, does it work? Well, let's go back to the last great aggregate demand shock we had, the one that was not confounded with an aggregate supply shock, so not the pandemic. Well, let's go back to 2008. And the prediction I gave you was that the price level would decline slowly over time. And here I'm showing the price level declining slowly over time relative to the pre-existing trend. Right? And I showed that output would collapse and then slowly recover. And that's also what actually happened. So this is a reassessment of AD-AS that I think I can teach with a straight face and actually believe, and that speaks to the way macroeconomists do their work today. It's only half the talk. The other thing we could do instead is abandon trying to fix that model and instead try and teach what it is that the Fed actually does. Adopt the language that the Fed uses, the media uses, and so on. And many of us have been hesitant to do so because when we were taught ISLM, it was a complicated mass of lines and things on a chart. But as the profession has gotten better at understanding what these models do, I think our language for describing it has become clearer and cleaner and accessible now to freshmen. So what I want to do now, I'm not going to teach you anything, but I can pretend that I'm teaching it to you because I want to show you how simple ISLM is. Actually, we call it ISMP when we strip it down because I want to give you the confidence that you will be able to walk into a first-year classroom and actually teach this approach instead. So, finally, let me just give you my last complaints about AD-AS as I make the transition. I'd like to say there's only 2 problems with AD-AS. It's what's on the vertical axis and what's on the horizontal axis. The problems with the vertical axis is it's the price level. When is the last time anyone ever reported on the price level? Does anyone in this room know what the level of the consumer price index is? Have you ever seen it reported? Have you ever heard Janet Yellen or Jay Powell describe it? In fact, can our students even see the price level? The price level, by the way, is 295. But I go to the supermarket and it's not there. I've never seen this thing. So this is an object that exists only in our models. And then the quantity of output, does anyone know what the level of output right now in the US is? Do you read that reported? Is this something that the Fed reports on? Again, the answer is no. So here I'm showing you data from the Fed's latest summary of economic projections. And what is it that people actually talk about in the world? They talk about not the level of output, but the change. They talk about some measure of unemployment. I'm going to spend more time talking about the output gap rather than unemployment, but they're basically conceptually the same thing, some measure of excess capacity. They talk about inflation and they talk about the interest rate. So what I want to do is equip our students to speak the language that we economists speak to the variables that they observe and speak to the variables that are being debated. And so then the idea is, can I teach ISMP to principal students? And let me try. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to tell them is, let's start with the IS curve. The real interest rate is the opportunity cost of spending money today rather than in the future. So therefore, the higher the real interest rate, the less money I will spend. And so it's going to say consumption declines as the real interest rate rises. Investment is particularly interest rate sensitive. We know how to tell that story. I'm never sure. Some people want to put government purchases as being completely unaffected by the real interest rate. The more money governments spend on debt servicing, the less money they spend on roads. And also states have balanced budgets. So because of that, I would be happy to actually to say you get some sort of effect coming through government purchases. It doesn't really matter. And net exports, you get a similar thing operating through exchange rates. So lower real interest rates get you to more C, more I, more G, and more NX. And that's the definition of aggregate expenditure. So therefore, all you have to do is add up C, I, G, and NX, and it must be that lower real interest rates lead to more aggregate expenditure. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to relabel that curve. So it leads to more aggregate expenditure. More aggregate expenditure leads to more output. That's the old sort of Keynesian thing. And if potential output is determined not at the level of the business cycle, it's constant, right? It's determined by the amount of capital and labour and R&D in the economy. So therefore, more output must mean a more positive output gap. And I make this final step because I want to talk about output gaps rather than output. So therefore, we now have a graph with the real interest rate against the output gap. And we put the real now I want to come back and I want to say we can do ISMP and actually still use an analogy with microeconomics. The real interest rate's a price. It's the price of spending today versus tomorrow. So we put that on the vertical axis. The output gap is a measure of quantity. We put that on the horizontal axis. And so you can think about an IS curve as sort of like being a macroeconomic demand curve. That's it. We just taught the whole IS curve. That was 4.5 minutes tops, right? Now we need the MP curve. So where do interest rates come from? They come from two places. First of all, the Fed sets the risk-free interest rate. I'm just going to assert that. They're going to read a whole chapter on monetary policy. We'll talk about monetary policy later on, but the Fed sets the short-term interest rate and it's a risk-free rate. That's Jay's job. Second thing, though, is that's not the only interest rate in the economy. The interest rates that you and I borrow at are determined by banks, which add a risk premium. And so what this does now is we've got the financial system in here mattering. So there's a risk premium added to the risk-free rate by the financial system, and that yields the real interest rate that you and I actually pay. Okay? So then you could say, what is monetary, and this is flat because monetary policy is flat. It's simple for now. So you could say, what if the Fed lowers rates? How does this work? Well, the purple arrow becomes shorter and the MP curve shifts. Simple as that. What if there's a financial crisis? The risk premium rises. Notice what we just did. We now have done what we all promised we'd do after 2008. We've put the financial sector into our macroeconomic models. And we've done so in a way that's transparent and accurate. So now we've got a complete model. We're done. What is macroeconomic equilibrium? It occurs where the IS curve meets the MP curve, and we've determined the equilibrium output gap and the real interest rate. And so this is the language the policymakers use. And so I think this is teachable. So what are the advantages of using this approach? The first argument is simply this is the language of policy debates. I was struck, I spent a couple of years at Brookings, and one of them was a year where Ben Bernanke was just recovering from the Fed. And so we'd have lunchtime conversations. And I was struck time after time. If you talk to Ben, he sounds like an ISMP guy. I read Paul's columns. If you talk to Paul kind of sounds like an ISMP guy. And so this is the language we keep hearing. We get around one of the most embarrassing parts of AD-AS. The worst part of AD-AS is it says we determine the price level and the quantity of output. They're determined by AD-AS. And then occasionally one of us gets this really smart student who says, but there's always inflation and the price level's always changing. And there's always economic growth and the output level's always changing. And so then you end up with these tortured explanations where in the last 2 pages of the chapter or the last 5 minutes of lecture, you say, hold on, that very simple graph I showed you with only 5 lines on it, it was an oversimplified lie. Because what's always happening is the aggregate supply curve's always marching to the right and the aggregate demand curve's always marching to the right and the complications I showed you are complications on top of that. And what I don't like doing is getting 60 minutes into a lecture and then telling the students I lied to them earlier. And so the reality of ongoing economic growth and ongoing inflation are very, very hard to get in AD-AS. But notice what we have here. We've got the output gap. And so there's not ongoing growth in this thing. This thing is stationary. And so what we get here is a very sharp distinction, a sharp separation between the determinants of potential output that we've probably taught earlier in the semester when we taught economic growth. Potential output's determined by capital, labour, human capital, and ideas. We probably all taught that lecture, right? And separately then we say we have these other models for talking about deviations from that potential output, right? And that's really good because occasionally you get to the end of semester and someone says, what determines output? And one student says it's K, L, and A, and another student says, no, it's aggregate expenditure. And they both end up quite confused. And if you look at a lot of our economic commentary, much of it ends up reflecting the confusion of commentators between short-run and long-run models. And so what this allows is a very sharp distinction between the two. It allows us to focus on the variables that students actually observe. They observe inflation, they observe interest rates, and they observe the output gap. It includes a central role for financial shocks, and that was very important through not only 2009, but in recent years. And in Britain, it may turn out to be very important awfully soon. And I haven't spent time on this, but it's very easily integrated with the Phillips curve. Because the central real variable here is the output gap, which maps perfectly onto a Phillips curve. The way we talk about Phillips curves is about a relationship between the output gap and unexpected inflation. We can take the analysis we just talked about, and if you want to teach the Phillips curve, you can connect the two very easily. And now we can talk about not just output and real interest rates, but also inflation, all in one single model. And then finally, this approach is going to prepare students for higher level classes, because what happens, they finish their freshman year, they turn up to sophomore macroeconomics, and the macro professor says, oh, they taught that AD-AS stuff last year, forget about it. I'm going to teach you ISLM. And that's another embarrassing conversation, either for them or for us, I'm not sure who. And so this time we've taught them the basics of ISMP, and then they can start adding bells and whistles to it. And I think the thing I care most about is actually, because this is how I think about the economy, it's no longer my least favorite day of the year. I walk in and they say, how does the macroeconomy work? And I talk about it using the language that I use when I talk to my colleagues, when I talk to my friends, when I talk to my when I talk to policymakers, and when I talk to Betsy, who's all of those things. Oh. So let me conclude. I think there's lots of reasons for pessimism. I'm going to follow the same emotional script that Alex did earlier. There's lots of reasons for pessimism about pollution. There's lots of reasons for pessimism about AD-AS. But there's also lots of reasons for optimism. One, we could do a whole lot better just by teaching it better, by teaching it as it applies to the economy as it exists. Or two, we can try a completely different approach in class. And so I'm much more optimistic that we can have more fun and teach more authentically when teaching macro. And in fact, this is how Betsy and I lay things out, which is if people who use our book, and I don't mean this as a book advertisement, if you want to teach AD-AS using the comic strip approach I described earlier, we have a pathway where you do that. And if what you want to do is teach ISMP, we have a pathway where we can do that. And if what you want to do is like the high wire balancing act of connecting ISMP with the Phillips curve, you can actually go through that as well, right? And then the rest of the policy chapters, you can take the rest, monetary policy and fiscal policy can be described in either language. And so you equip students with enough that they'll be able to talk about policy usefully and authentically.